Sheffield Showcase Festival. It's a weekend-long festival of events taking place in cultural venues around the city. So when we finish here, do look online, you may find lots of other things to do this afternoon and tomorrow in other places too. We're delighted to welcome David Price. David is an author, he's a speaker, he's the author of the highly respected Sheffield Troublemakers, amongst others. And today, he's going to talk about Samuel Holberry, one of the, and I quote here, the most controversial and polarising figures in Sheffield's history. But maybe today, maybe we'll discover a little more about who he really was. Hope you enjoy the talk. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah, okay, people can, yes. I came to the two lectures this morning and they covered, I think probably 800 to 1,000 years, each of them. I'm going to concentrate on one day, I think, the 11th to 12th of January 1840. As Dan has just said, Samuel Holberry is one of the most controversial figures in Sheffield history. There are at least three views about him. And there he is. That's the bust that appears in Weston Park Museum. I think it's the only likeness of him that we have, as far as I know. And here are the three views of Holberry. The conventional view, the view of the ruling classes, the middle classes, the courts, and so on, that he was a dangerous revolutionary, leader of a violent Chartist plot to take control of Sheffield on the 12th of January 1840. As a result, he was jailed in Northallerton House of Correction and made illegally to walk the treadmill. He contracted TB and died at the age of only 27 in 1842. And here is his grave, which is quite a lot visited in the General Cemetery. A street, Holberry Gardens in Broom Hall, was named after him. His early death gave rise to the radical Chartist view of him as a hero and martyr. A Chartist leader called Harney organised his funeral so that it was one of the biggest events in Sheffield in the 19th century. And then, more than a century later, as Sheffield became more and more left-wing in the 1970s, this radical view of him was revived. A Holberry Society was formed. Holberry was commemorated in the Cascades in the Peace Gardens. There in honour of Holberry. And there's a plaque there which I recommend you go and look at and read exactly what it says. It's very interesting. There's a further twist to the story. In 2009, a researcher called Catherine Lewis produced a dissertation and a closely argued article entitled Samuel Holberry, Chartist Conspirator or Victim of a State Conspiracy? She believed that Holberry had not in fact planned a Sheffield Rising on the 12th of January 1840. Instead, she thought that, convinced of Holberry's guilt, the police, the magistrates and the prosecutors used the rules of criminal procedure and evidence in a grossly one-sided way to ensure a conviction. I call this the revisionist view of Holberry, as an unfortunate Chartist activist who was framed and persecuted by the state. So, today I'm going to re-examine the evidence and try and reach a balanced judgment about who Holberry really was, by drilling down into the detail of this famous affair we can find out a lot about Victorian Sheffield and Victorian England. And my talk will be structured like this, so you know what you're into. I'll try and allow enough time for some questions at the end. So we start with the historical context. In the 1830s in England, the working classes were in an angry mood. There were various reasons for this. First of all, workers had campaigned strongly for parliamentary reform, but when it came in 1832, it only gave the vote to the middle classes. And then, shortly afterwards, the Whig government introduced a brutal new workhouse regime for those facing poverty. They preserved the corn laws that were pushing up the price of bread, relevant to today's problems perhaps. And then in 1837, a prolonged economic depression began, which lasted for about 6 years. And all these things affected workers in Sheffield, many of whom were near to destitution, including Holberry and his colleagues. Out of 9 Sheffield Chartists who were imprisoned following the events of January 1840, 5 had been unemployed for over a year. Moreover, another factor, since the 1790s, the time of just after the French Revolution, the working class in Sheffield had been as activist and as politicised as any working class group in the whole country, possibly more so. In 1837, working class activists and some middle class sympathisers came together to form the Sheffield Working Men's Association. Then the Chartist movement appeared nationally, and it called for 6 points, which were constitutional changes designed to give the power to the working class, notably manhood suffrage. I'm afraid female suffrage had to wait a bit longer. So the Sheffield Working Men's Association became part of the Chartist movement, which was a massive national movement. There'd been nothing like it ever before. The Chartists held numerous meetings in Paradise Square and elsewhere, and increasingly such meetings were banned by the magistrates, and they would go up on Sky Edge or all sorts of unusual places to hold their meetings. In 1839, the Chartists launched a massive national petition, and Sheffield contributed many signatures. But in July 1839, this petition was rejected by Parliament. Now, this created a huge dilemma for the Chartists. How could they now pursue the Charter? They thought of having what they called a sacred month, a month's general strike in August, but this was given up as impractical. A small strike did take place in a few places in August, in Sheffield and some other places, but not on a significant scale. There were rather interesting occupations of parish churches during divine service, which happened in Sheffield. But the big issue was whether to use force, and there was a split between the moral force Chartists and the physical force Chartists. Planning the use of force was very difficult because the organisation of the Chartists was weak, communications were difficult, the railway network was sort of about to go in, but wasn't really there in 1840. It was sort of developing, but not very effective. Many of the Chartist leaders were put in jail, And then the authorities were liable to use spies and inject them into Chartist groups. But there was the idea of a general rising in November 1839, but it didn't really happen. The two areas that were most militant were Wales and West Yorkshire. We were part of West Yorkshire in those days, West Riding. And even in these two militant areas, a coordinated rising didn't take place. Instead, there were sporadic risings, of which the biggest and most famous was in Newport, in South Wales. And Newport was a disaster for the Chartists. They were encountered by soldiers, and 22 Chartists were killed and 50 were severely wounded. Now let's have a look at Sheffield's militant Chartist leader, Samuel Holberry. And we come back to that slide that I've already shown you. He was a young man of 25 in January 1840. The Sheffield Independent described him like this: a very tall, well-formed and muscular young man, with much of the appearance and manner of an itinerant showman. It's rather surprising, isn't it? On the one hand, he's tough, but on the other, he's a bit charismatic, like a showman. Another newspaper described him as cadaverous, which means like a corpse. So it's very confusing, isn't it? I tend to go for the first one, that he was a pretty impressive young man. He was born in East Retford, the son of an agricultural labourer who had 9 children to bring up. At the age of 16, he joined the 33rd Regiment of Foot and served in the army for 5 years. Among other things, rather interestingly, he joined the ultra-Protestant or Orange Lodge, perhaps a sign of fanaticism. He was stationed for a time in Northampton, which is a radical town influenced by radical shoemakers. And he attended a night school, and he became disgusted with army life. In 1835, he borrowed money from his parents and bought himself out. And he destroyed every memento of his army career. And he moved to Sheffield, where he got a job as a rectifying distiller. I couldn't explain exactly what that is, but it's something in the spirits industry. Then, unfortunately, he became redundant, and he moved to London for 10 months. And around this time, he became deeply involved in working class politics. In 1838, his Sheffield employers invited him back, and he returned, and he joined the Sheffield Chartists. He was a Baptist by origin, and he was involved in the church goings at the parish church. He became the leader of the revolutionary group among the Sheffield Chartists. I think because his impressive appearance, his military background, and his experience outside Sheffield, all over the country in fact. And he represented the Chartists from Sheffield at meetings in Newcastle and London at the end of 1839. He was both sharp and tough. Apparently, he threatened to blow out the brains of any Chartist who was not in their classes or groups on the Saturday night of the uprising at 10 p.m. That's the sort of man he was. Now we come to the sequence of events in Holberry's plot in Sheffield, as most historians have understood. One of the most distinguished Chartist historians is Malcolm Chase. He says the plans for a rising on the 12th of January were apparently confirmed when delegates from northern England met in Dewsbury on the 28th of December. That's probably just a couple of weeks before the fatal days of the 11th and 12th. Holberry was hyperactive in the first days of January. On the 4th of January, he was in Dewsbury talking to the Chartists there. On the 10th of January, he was in Nottingham. And before and after these trips, he was at Sheffield meetings, mainly at the Chartists' headquarters, which was the Fig Tree Lane meeting room. Now, my friend David Bradley has produced this map for me, and I'm going to trace what happened in the next sort of 24 hours on using this plan. And the Fig Tree, now is this working? Let's see. No, I didn't work.
It's there, yeah, a little higher.
Is it? Oh, where is it?
You hold it down.
I can't see it now. Anyway, you can see in the middle of the plan, the Fig Tree Lane meeting room, right near the parish church, as it then was. He met there with an inner group of leaders of the 8 classes. Now, a class, it was a Methodist word, but it was a group of committed people, and each with a leader, and the leader of the classes would meet together with Holberry to plan what was going to happen. Now, one of the people at the meeting of the classes was a Rotherham representative called James Allen, who was a stove grate fitter and landlord of the Station Inn in Rotherham. Now, his colleagues were very suspicious of James Allen because he'd been seen talking to the police chief, Mr. Bland, in Rotherham. So they excluded him from their meetings, and their suspicions were justified. He was in fact feeding information to Bland. And Bland had actually told Hugh Parker, the 67-year-old senior magistrate in Sheffield, that a big rising was being planned. But Parker said, "Oh, that's impossible, I can't believe that, that's rubbish." So Bland went back to Rotherham, still deeply concerned. And when Allen told him that he'd been excluded from the Chartist meeting, Bland, who was an ingenious man, thought up a device to get Allen back into the meetings so that he could pass on the information. He said to Allen, "Look, you go in there and offer a large group, say 150 men from Rotherham, to join in the uprising. They won't be able to resist that." So that's what James Allen did, and he was readmitted into this closed group. A fatal decision. The crucial final meeting took place at a pub in Lambert Street, and Lambert Street, just to the left of Fig Tree Lane. Yeah. And it was on at 3 p.m. in the afternoon of Saturday, the 11th of January. And then, at that meeting, Holberry disclosed his plan to take over Sheffield the following night. The evidence is a bit confusing, but the plot was something like this. The classes or groups were to meet at their usual meeting place at 10 p.m. that night for an inspection of arms. At 2 a.m., 4 of the classes, with altogether some 200 men, would take the town hall. Now, the town hall is the building you're probably familiar with in Waingate that's been greatly enlarged, so it doesn't look like that now. It looks much more elegant than it does now. Incidentally, it's a building that desperately needs to be preserved for the sake of Sheffield heritage, and it's rather questionable what will happen to it. Anyway, at the same time as one group were taking the town hall, the contingents from Rotherham and Attercliffe would take the Tontine Inn opposite. It's a great pity the Tontine Inn was pulled down. It was the principal coaching inn in Sheffield, so it was the place from which the coaches to London and to York and everywhere else went. There wasn't a proper railway connection yet in 1840. So it's a very, very important strategic point. If the Chartists were put off from taking these places, they would Moscow the town. Now, what does that mean? It's an allusion to the Russian decision to burn Moscow to prevent, in order to thwart Napoleon's invasion of their country, which is what they did, of course. Moscow the town set fire to it. After the soldiers had left the barracks, and the barracks the barracks are right up at the top of them. That's not the Hillsborough barracks. In those days, the barracks were in Upperthorpe. So you imagine the soldiers leaving those barracks, then the Chartists would move in and set fire to them. And they would also set fire to magistrates' houses. It was quite a ruthless plot. At the end of the meeting on that Saturday afternoon, James Allen rushed back to Rotherham. He arrived at 7 p.m, we're told, almost breathless with haste and trembling with fear. He disclosed his plans to Bland, the police chief, and Lord Howard of Effingham. This man, of a very noble family. They were waiting for him. Lord Howard then jumped on his horse and galloped to Sheffield. At 10 p.m, he arrived at the police office in the town hall. So we're back at the town hall, which was also the police office and also had the cells for prisoners in the basement. There are still cells there in the building that I was saying must be preserved in Waingate. The Sheffield police chief, Thomas Rayner, was alerted. The army was at the barracks, was also alerted. A detachment of soldiers was called out immediately. Now, either at 10 p.m. or at 12 midnight, and there's a question about the right timing of this incident, Rayner, the police chief in Sheffield, and his assistant, a man called Wild, and other policemen arrived at Holberry's home, 19 Hare Lane. I'm going to give you, Dan and I are going to give you a bit more information about what happened on this occasion, but I'll just briefly summarise it. Now, Holberry's wife, Mary, was pregnant. But she loved, and she opened the door. Rainier and Wild went upstairs and found Holberry in his bed, fully dressed apart from his shoes. They took Holberry downstairs to the custody of the policeman. Then they went up into the garret or attic, and there they found a loaded horse pistol, 12 hand grenades, 18 fireballs, 36 tin cases, 3 torches, 100 or 200 iron bullets, and a bottle that seemed to be a kind of bomb. Rayner said that Holberry was very candid and appeared desirous of giving them information. Holberry said, "I will tell you anything about myself, but nothing about anyone else." Samuel and Mary Holberry were then taken to the police office and locked up. Meanwhile, the classes had met separately at 10 p.m. Some then went to different parts of town. Others stayed indoors in their classes. Between 11 p.m. and midnight, one group was told by an Irish class leader called Duffy that the troops were out. This made a great difference. Also, as the night went on, they would have realised that Holberry was not there to lead them. There is an argument that Holberry gave a message out that their plot had been betrayed. And I don't know what to make of that. That's another complication of the story. During that night, there was an extraordinary series of strange incidents and arrests in various parts of Sheffield. And we'll just go through some of them. Around 1:30 a.m., a considerable body of men was seen by soldiers at Glossop Road, marching to the town with spears. Glossop Road's on the bottom left of the map. At 2:30 a.m., near St George's Church, which is just above Glossop Road on the map, a police watchman met a company of armed men who fired at him with a blunderbuss and attacked him with swords and cutlasses. He ran away, suffering an injury to his hand and a stabbing in his back, and he spent the next month in the General Infirmary. At 2:30 a.m. also, a dragoon corporal saw 50 men armed with long pikes near a chapel in Carver Street. Near the dams in Crooksmore, you can see them on the extreme left, in the middle of the plan. Police and dragoons found 3 men hiding something over a wall. It was a dagger. And then they found a loaded pistol and another dagger. Then the police went to Thomas Booker's house in Bennett Lane and found 2 young men, William Booker and Samuel Foxall, with guns, loaded pistols and ball cartridges. Another group of Chartists went to the newly opened Botanical Gardens and hid their weapons there. There were also disturbances in Dewsbury. During Saturday night, a party of 100 to 150 men, armed with muskets and bayonets, took over the centre of Dewsbury, firing their weapons. Watchmen and police fled. And order wasn't restored until Sunday afternoon when the dragoons arrived. You can imagine the perturbation in Sheffield with all these things happening. On the Monday, the 30th of January, 6 magistrates, led by the elderly Hugh Parker, and including 2 Anglican clergy and Lord Howard, plus Colonel Martin, commander of the Dragoons, they all met in the session room at the town hall for what are called committal proceedings. These are the proceedings which decide to send a suspected person to the assizes. And this is the sort of room where these committal proceedings would have taken place. It's in fact a somewhat later room which is still there in the old town hall and desperately needs to be preserved. Mr. Palfreyman and Mr. Rogers prosecuted. Numerous weapons were on display on a table in the middle of the court. 2 of the captured Chartists gave Queen's evidence, Samuel Thompson and Samuel Foxall. These committal proceedings went on for several more days, as more Chartists were brought before the magistrates. And the magistrates were joined by a very distinguished figure, the Earl of Fitzwilliam. There he is. And his house was somewhat different from the two-room back-to-back house that Holberry lived in. It has the widest facade of any private house in Europe, apparently. In the end, Holberry and 7 other Chartists were indicted to appear at the York Spring Assizes. The magistrates charged Holberry and Thomas Booker with high treason, the highest offence in the land. And do you know the penalty in those days was still hanging, drawing and quartering? But mercifully, the drawing and quartering now took place after death. The prisoners were taken off by the dragoons to jail in York. On Monday the 16th of March, the assize proceedings began in York under Mr. Justice Erskine in this court. Attorney General for the Duchy of Lancaster, I didn't know such a post existed until I did this research, Mr. Sergeant Hatton led the prosecution. Interestingly, they gave up on high treason and instead went for riot and seditious conspiracy, probably because not enough had actually happened to justify a treason charge. On the 16th of March, 5 men were charged. The Attorney General told the jury that their offence was of a most grave and serious nature. Indeed, it borders upon the highest offence known to the law of England, I mean the offence of high treason. And he described Holberry as the contriver of the scheme. Holberry was found guilty and sentenced to 4 years at Northallerton House of Correction. This rather unpleasant-looking building had an unusually severe prison regime. So that's the story of the uprising in Sheffield as understood by most historians. However, there is this question by a historian called Catherine Lewis, and she points out that there are problems in this story. So let's look at some of the problems. First, there is the mysterious figure of James Allen. He betrayed the plot and caused the arrest of the Chartist leaders. Yet he didn't give evidence at the trial. He'd been to all the meetings. He could have told the jury a whole lot of things. So why was this? And how do we know about his role? And this is where things get very strange. 24 years later, on the 16th of January 1864, someone called John Taylor gave a talk to the Young Men's Christian Association at Townhead in Sheffield about how the Chartist conspiracy 24 years earlier had been detected. This talk was subsequently published in full in the Sheffield newspapers. Taylor's paper explained the reasons really why Allen's role was concealed for all this time. One reason was that there was a danger that Allen would be assassinated. Earl Fitzwilliam, who we've just seen, persuaded Lord Normanby, the Home Secretary, to find Allen suitable employment in the original trade of stove grate fitter in the south of England, to hide him away, in other words, from the local Chartists. Catherine Lewis doesn't think this explains his absence from the trial because the Times, in January 1840, actually said that it was visitations of conscience in one of the delegates from Rotherham that prevented the plot being executed. And Allen was the only Rotherham man in his secret meetings, but perhaps the Chartists didn't read the Times and missed that. I think that, however, that the Sheffield newspapers were persuaded by the magistrates or the police to keep quiet about Allen for 2 reasons. One was to protect Alan. But John Taylor's paper gives us another stronger reason. And this is the role of Lady Howard, the wife of Lord Howard of Effingham. And this is a nice house in Rotherham where they lived. And she was terrified that Chartists would come to this house and assassinate her husband for his part in defeating the conspiracy. So Lord Howard, I quote, yielding to her natural fears, bound Mr. Bland, the Rotherham police chief, and his officers beforehand in a solemn promise to conceal the part that he and they might take in the matter in order to avoid the vengeance of the Chartists. Now, local newspaper editors wouldn't want to upset a prominent local aristocrat like Lord Howard. Catherine Lewis also suggests that John Taylor's paper may be misleading about Alan's character. It describes him as led by pangs of conscience. But maybe he was really a police spy and an agent provocateur. There were plenty of those around in those days. And this theory is backed up by a letter from Richard Audley, a moderate Chartist, to the Sheffield Daily Telegraph. He said that he believed Alan had tried to recruit him into the violent plot. So that's interesting. But we shall never probably know exactly what Alan's motivation was, unless some new evidence comes to light. The second question about this story is, how reliable were the key prosecution witnesses in the trial? The police and the prosecution had a problem. They couldn't bring Alan into the witness box. So they persuaded two of the conspirators they'd arrested, Samuel Thompson and Samuel Foxwell, two Samuels, to change sides and turn Queen's evidence. And their evidence was crucial in getting the jury to convict Holberry and his colleagues. How were Thompson and Foxwell induced to change sides? It cannot have been an easy decision for them. Both had sworn a blood-curdling oath in order to become part of the inner group of conspirators. And this is the oath. I do most solemnly and sincerely promise in the sight of an almighty God and the assembly here present that I will assassinate anyone who betrays the secrets of this meeting and bear assassination if I shall betray it. That must have made them hesitate. But Thompson revealed to the court the following. The reason I'm in the witness box instead of the dock is because I was offered by the magistrates a legal advisor. I accordingly had one and told him everything. Mr. Broomhead is a solicitor in Sheffield. He told me that it would be advisable for me to tell the truth and so to get out of the scrape. But I principally volunteered to give evidence because my father was taken. He was taken on Sunday morning and afterwards discharged. I considered the Chartist oath not lawful at all. So Thompson was in part a dutiful son looking after his father, whom the police had somewhat unscrupulously arrested in order to trap the son. But his solicitor Broomhead would have had another argument. Thompson, you're at risk of the penalty for high treason, and you know what that is. Only later was that risk removed, so we can understand why Thompson changed sides. Foxwell said that he'd begun to be afraid ever since his arrest. He was locked up in the same cell as Thompson, and they discussed the trial. He'd seen a different solicitor, Mr. Palfrey, several times, but he maintained that the evidence he was giving was his own. It was Thompson who clearly described the plan for that Saturday night as a conspiracy to take over Sheffield, to assault the town hall and the Tontine Inn. Foxwell's evidence was more confusing, but he does mention another extreme measure, the idea of Moscow, the town. Catherine Lewis suggests that the plot to create Chartist forts and massacre the town was invented by the police or the solicitors. But I doubt whether they would come up with outlandish ideas like this. They were part of the Sheffield establishment, and the last thing that establishment wanted was for Sheffield to get an even worse reputation for revolutionary behaviour than it already had. It seems to me much more likely that these plans came mainly from the ex-soldier Holberry. And my view on this is reinforced by a fascinating incident in the committal proceedings. Holberry interrogated Thompson about his revelations about the Chartist plans for the uprising. And interestingly, Holberry doesn't say to Thompson, "Your evidence is a pack of lies." No. What he does is suggest that Thompson was involved in drawing up these plans. Holberry said, "Do you not remember when we were alone at my house, laying down this plan of attack, and wished me to bring it forward at the next meeting of the council?" Thompson said no. But I think it's fascinating that Holberry suggests that the plan of attack was broadly as Thompson had described it, but is trying to point out that Thompson shared responsibility for this plan. My third question is, did Holberry have a fair trial? Catherine Lewis points out rightly many shortcomings in the criminal trial system at this time. One thing was that the accused could not testify in their own defence. Another, they lacked ready access to legal advice. Holberry was represented in court by a barrister called Watson, who apparently acted as counsel for many prisoners. But I suspect that Holberry only spoke briefly to him. His contribution to the trial was unimpressive. His questions to Samuel Thompson were inconsequential. His summing up failed to convince the jury. According to the Sheffield Argus, the jury decided on a guilty verdict without scarcely turning round in their box. It was not really a fair trial by modern standards. Worse still, one of the officers of the court may have been indirectly responsible for Holberry's death. In a letter now in the public archives, the clerk to the assizes boasted that he persuaded Mr. Justice Erskine to send the worst offenders, including Holberry, to North Allerton House of Correction, where they are worse fed and hard worked. Even if Holberry didn't have a fair trial by modern standards, I'm not persuaded by the suggestion that, by Catherine Lewis, that Holberry had no plans for an uprising at all on the night of 11th of January 1840. Many strange things happened that night, not only in Sheffield, also in Dewsbury. Many weapons were discovered, and Holberry didn't deny that he'd planned an uprising. So, who was Samuel Holberry? I'll start with a strange conversation. Strange conversation which, according to the police chief, John Rayner, and his assistant Wilde, had with Holberry and his wife when they arrived there on the night of the 11th of January. Now, Dan Marshall is kindly going to play the parts of Mary and Samuel Holberry, and I will be the narrator and the police. I think if you could come over this way and it'll help with the we are filming this talk. Thank you. So, here is Wilde, a policeman at the door of Holberry's house in Ayr. Does someone called Hartley live here?
No, he does not. I know who you want. You want a person called Otley.
Otley was a well-known moderate Sheffield Troublemakers leader. What's your name?
That's my business.
I may as well be candid with you. We're going to search for arms and ammunition. Mary then went to the foot of the stairs and called.
My dear, get up.
upstairs and found Holberry laid on the bed in the chamber, dressed in all but his shoes. He rose up in bed. "What have you got in your pocket?" Sorry, what's the police? He made no answer. So Wild took a dagger from his side pocket. "Are you one of these persons called Chartists?"
I am.
"Are you a moral or physical force Chartist?" Wild looked at the dagger and said, "Surely you would not take a knife?"
But I would in obtaining the Charter and in defence of liberty. Mind, I am no thief, no robber. I'll fight for the Charter, but I'll not rest until I have it. To that, I've made up my mind. Distress has driven me to it.
"You are very candid." Wild searched the box in the chamber.
You'll not find anything there. What you want is upstairs, and I'll go with you.
"Oh no, you must go downstairs." I don't know what you made of that exchange. It's possible that police invented part of it, but to me it has the ring of truth about it. And what's fascinating is Holberry's realism and mood of resignation when the police come to his home. Here he is, aged 25, facing the biggest crisis of his life. He must know that his whole plot has collapsed, and he's at risk of a death sentence or transportation. Yet he answers the police in a straightforward and honest way. He was a gambler who'd been playing for very high stakes and lost. He's cool and resilient under pressure. What was driving him when you heard the words, "Destitution has driven me to it"? His personal situation was fragile in the extreme. He was redundant from his job. An inspector of prisons who interviewed him later in prison stated that when working, he only earned 25 to 30 shillings a week. But for 4 months before the 12th of January 1840, he lived on selling his furniture and possibly on secret resources from within the Chartist movement. They can't have amounted to much. His wife at the time was expecting a baby. Mary Holberry was an active supporter of the cause. She would later write eloquent letters to politicians and newspapers calling for Samuel's release from prison. Sadly, their baby died after 18 weeks. Later on, Mary remarried, but she called one of her children of her second marriage Holberry. She remained an active Chartist. And when she died in 1883, guess where she was married? She was buried alongside her husband in the general cemetery. So to conclude, I see Holberry's plan as deeply flawed for 2 reasons. First, they were a motley group of conspirators. They included a spy and 2 conspirators who changed sides. Most of them were very untrained revolutionaries, though there were a few who had military experience, including one who'd actually fought at Waterloo. The behaviour of the conspirators, even before they knew that Holberry had been arrested, was haphazard and ill-disciplined. I would question whether they had the discipline and willpower to have carried through Holberry's plan effectively. And that gets us to the second fatal flaw. They grossly underestimated the power of the ruling class. There was an interesting bit in the trial where Samuel Thompson said that these Chartists saw this as a property government. They thought that as soon as these soldiers and policemen and magistrates realised that their houses and their barracks were being set fire to, They would leave the town centre to take care of their property. And then these powerful people would give in to the charter. He said the authorities would think more of their own property than the town. And to save their own property, they would leave the town to itself. This was a naive misreading of the situation, as events in Newport should have made clear. The authorities would have relentlessly pursued the Chartists in this situation. And if the soldiers stationed in Sheffield failed, they'd have brought plenty of soldiers from elsewhere to reinforce them. It's very difficult to achieve a revolution if the ruling classes are cohesive and supported by loyal armed forces. I'd question all three of these views of Holberry. The conventional view ignores the complacency of the upper and middle classes about the abject poverty of the working classes at the time, which had provoked the crisis. The radical view that he was a hero and martyr fails to question whether physical force could be justified and whether it could achieve its goals. The revisionist view just has not enough evidence to back it. So to conclude, I see Holberry as a tragic figure who's driven towards extreme action by personal distress, by a commitment to liberty for the working class, and I think by a streak of fanaticism in his character. He possessed the charisma, imagination and drive of a potential revolutionary leader, but he misjudged what was possible with the people he was leading against a formidable and cohesive state.